as a tourism, and his day job or his field of work is deputy director of marketing for Gauteng's leading tourist attractions, Great Human and that's just the surface Anthony. He's a sorcerer and a chess player, and he's a bird atlaser of note, but not just a random bird atlaser.
Like Jeff.
Like Jeff. Jeff is a sustained in one place bird atlaser. But Anthony's bird atlasing painters are arranged in the shape of a bird, and the atlasing is calculated mathematically. So it's an arty bird with a mathematical driver to color it in. It's a binomial pyramid. You know those chaps in the circus, one stands on two, stands on two. And if one isn't properly anchored or is weedy or something, the whole pyramid collapses. So Anthony birds his pentats binomially so that there's no out of sync. And the top dog pentat is Northcliffe. Do you live at Northcliffe? Oh, so it's his home pentat. Yeah, so that's and that's been a 14-year project. So it's coming to an end now. We're going to have an atlasing finishing party.
Yeah, I hope to have an exhibition.
Oh, yeah. And then Anthony's talk tonight stems from his love of language. He's a Herman Charles Bosman fan, and he does a good work stock and enjoys being work stock. But he speaks English, Afrikaans, Zulu, Setswana, and recently he's taught himself Spanish online, or learned Spanish online. You'll have to ask him why later. Spanish, I fear. Anyway, and one of his aspects of language is in etymology. Etymology. Especially he loves South African words and have an historical etymology. But it's that that's brought us to this point, which is the talk about body parts, the body of evidence, evidence of the body and the body of evidence. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks very much. Good evening. Look, I hope people don't mind if I sit while I present, if that's okay. I can project my voice. I can probably take off my COVID mask as well. If I just keep my distance from all you COVID people. So is that okay if I sit? Because otherwise I'll delegate someone to the function. All right, as Judy pointed out, thanks very much for the welcome, Judy. Tonight's lecture attempts to cover the whole body of a bird, exemplifying each body part by at least one species. It's over 100 slides long, so best that we get a move along as fast as possible. The lights can go off or on. I'm not fussed either way.
That's pretty good.
Is everyone okay with the current conditions? Yeah. So without further ado, let's launch into what I've actually done. I did a bit of, I've dolled up this presentation so that I've now done some research into the background of it. Jeff, how many species do we have in Southern Africa? I don't know an exact number, but
980 something.
yeah. Well, I know that Ian Sinclair's on 941, Trevor Hardiker's on 940. So there must be at least that many birds, but there's probably a few that both of them have skipped. So I was reckoning on 950, 960, but if Jeff says there's 980, that probably includes very hard outliers. But I examined in terms of those whose generic name contains the reference to at least one body part. And I found the most popular body part was the bill, with 10% of names based on the bill, followed by the tail, wing, back, head, throat, breast, chest, and crown and belly, and in more or less descending order. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little bit of the tour, a tour of the bird, so that we, you know, when birds are measured, they're not measured from their crown to their feet, they're measured from the tip of their bill to their feet. So I thought the first thing to do is to pick up the bill, and then we'll take it from there. The green wood hoopoo used to be an example for this group. Should it still be a red-billed wood hoopoo, given that the bird that you can see on your right there is a juvenile and clearly doesn't have a red bill? Is green okay? Well, I've never seen a violet wood hoopoo properly, so I wouldn't know how easy it would be to distinguish that, but I'm okay with the new name, and I'm usually not. A thick-billed weaver is another example of a bill, and you can see a very different kind of bill that we're involved with here, and the diversity of bills is simply astonishing. So you get an African spoonbill, which you all know sort of puts its bill down in the bottom of the mud and does all kinds of stuff and magically produces sufficient food to nourish itself in a completely different way, for example, to how the greater flamingo does that. And then on another level, for example, you've got things like a Cape shoveler. So the diversity of bills is simply enormous, and there's probably a whole lecture on birds feeding and feeding strategies. But we're not going to go into this in detail because we've already actually deviated from tonight's subject. But just to finish up a little bit, there are obviously different bill shapes. The common bill shape is the decurved bill, the one that curves down, but you do get the odd bird like the avocets that you see in the top right corner there. We've got recurved bills, the bill that curves upwards. And obviously, if you look at various waders, you will see there's a subtle variation in the shape and exact minor curvature and so on of their bill, reflecting their different feeding habits or strategies. So having got past the bill, now we can now move to the top of the head, and there are the words in order that refer to parts near the top of the head in order of prevalence: head, crown, cap, crest, hood, nape, and helmet, which we will now try and cover in their sequence. To me, the red-headed finch is well named because the area of the anatomy that is red is indeed what I would call the head. But what you keep finding with these bird anatomy names is that they're approximations, and you don't always see exactly the part being reflected. For example, in the red-headed weaver, it clearly has got also a red chest and a red nape. So it's a little bit more than the head. So should we have perhaps called this the red-hooded weaver? I don't know, but I don't think the name would have done any harm, and it would have perhaps reflected more accurately. But of course, again, it's a male chauvinist name because the female doesn't display a red head even in the midst of the breeding season. The grey-headed bushshrike is another one that might have been a good candidate for a hood. And then we move through to the crown. And if you think of it, if you try and conceive of what is the crown on that bird, there's at least 4 different ways in which you might interpret the crown. So firstly, it's a white tiara on a black head, which could be the crown, or it could be the inner black circle on top of the head, which is the crown, or it could be the inner circle, which is white, containing a black circle, which could be the crown, or it could be the whole black section. And all of those approximate the crown to a lesser or greater extent. But I mean, it shows, no one's explained to me exactly which of those 4 interpretations is the one whereby the bird is called that thing. And maybe it's because I've come from a fine arts background that I actually ask myself, well, how and where is this crown approximated? I would say that the one that comes over the bill and goes down to the nape is a little bit more than a crown, but maybe it's a generous crown. Then you get these, the left-hand bird, many people in this room will remember as the three-streak chagra. For some other reason, it became the brown crown chagra. And I've always been not convinced that that crown is quite brown. It's kind of quite a very gray brown to me. But the black crown chagra, I think, is stably and aptly named. Obviously, any of these names are actually, to an extent, arbitrary. In the case of the crowned crane, I presume the crown is that series of spikes which emanate almost from the nape. So that is a completely different design of crown, but again, using the same word. I mean, in a human being, I think the crown would be often a reference to the point which your hair circles around, but it could be any way from there down into your hairline, and maybe because humans have got a history of wearing hats, and obviously the most regal of those would be the crown, the symbol of royalty, of which the grey crowned crane has got something of a regal look. And then there's the cap. The cap, obviously, in human terms, I find that your first language is often the most difficult language to interpret, because your depth of language is so profound that you can't actually determine which of your meanings is the correct intended one, or in fact, if you actually are ever going to know what the intended one is. You can certainly see that the dark cap bulbul has got a different shaped cap to the bush black cap, as an example. And then another interpretation of a cap would be using as the model the capped wheat ear, which I said jokingly could be called a sharp-billed, white-browed, white-throated, black-collared, black-eared, tawny-flanked, black-tailed wheat ear, or any combination of the above. But just to point out that whatever feature that you choose to zoom in on is probably fairly close to arbitrary. And I mean, I should point out here that in the list of 320 names, those are only the genus ones, and I've omitted those ones. Sorry, they're only the species ones. I've omitted genus ones, such as wheat ear, where there's reference to the ear in the genus name as well. Those would add at least another 34 to the list. I haven't gone into that one in depth, but obviously that would bring it well past a third of birds have this anatomical reference somewhere in their name. But then there's the crest. The crest is the thing that sits kind of on top of that, but again, it could be a number of different things. Usually the crest is expected to emanate from above where the crown is, but quite often it's in that place where you see, for example, in the long-crested eagle, where it emanates from, I don't know if you would call that the joining point between the nape and the crown, or whether it just comes out from the back of the crown. But, that's not the only interpretation of what a crest is. A crested guinea fowl is another example with its very cool sort of 60s vibey op art suit and pretty cool hairdo and red eye. So that's, again, demonstrates that these words don't have absolute meanings, and they're applied quite across the board. And to some extent, I suppose we should challenge them, like asking whether a brown-hooded kingfisher actually has a hood, and whether that hood actually is brown, or whether it's in fact gray. But we can't go for gray-headed or gray-hooded because it belongs to the insect bird there, the gray-headed kingfisher. So, and if you went for the turquoised winged bird, it would be competing with the striped kingfisher, the woodland kingfisher, and the mangrove kingfisher of the kingfishers that we are familiar with in Southern Africa. Again, which part of this thing is the hood? I've asked myself not knowingly, let's not say despairingly, but is the hood in fact the bare facial skin that comes over the top, or is the hood like a hoodie that you pull up behind here and he's got like a woolly sort of hoodie on the back of his head? So we think we know what these things mean, but once you start addressing them, you realize that some of them are less than obvious. But the key thing is we're just reminding ourselves of the different parts of the anatomy of different birds. The rufous nape lark certainly has a nape, but it's not the only part of it that's rufous. And as you can see from the various pictures, the portion that is rufous varies seasonally and I think to an extent with gender and certainly with age, and probably even to an extent with habitat. But we all know that very familiar grassland bird, which goes, and it's very easy to identify in summer in any case. But in winter, I must admit that picture on the bottom left, I had to ask Etienne Marais, what bird is this? And I was slightly embarrassed to learn that he was of the view that it's easily seen as a rufous nape lark. And I don't think I've got, I think I've got better, but I think to attain the level of very experienced birders like that is something that most of us can probably never hope to do, because yeah, larks can be tricky, and as I'm sure everyone can attest. The helmeted guinea fowl brings to the end that group about the top of the head, and it certainly has quite a cool helmet. I don't know if anyone's ever seen those visuals where they've taken the head from a funny angle and made it into a kind of rhino bird or something like that. And I must admit, the first time I looked at that kind of image, I did have to do a double take. But certainly, in some kind of respect, it is like Kaiser Wilhelm's helmet or a helmet of that kind. And certainly, it's more easily recognizable what on this bird is deemed to be the helmet. The next group we're going to look at is kind of the rest of the head. The most popular one there is the throat, followed by the face, neck, ear, cheek, front. I'm still not sure that I know what a front is, and it's a pretty tricky word, that to me. Then the brow, the eye, the mask and beard, the wattle, chin and whisker, and finally the nose, bridle and spectacle. The throat, I think, it's probably acceptable that this bird is called a white-throated swallow, because that area that I would deem to call the throat is almost the one that's been outlined by those dark blue-black surrounds. And so I think that bird is very, very aptly named. But the bar-throated apollo, you could argue that the bar is not actually on the throat, but the bar delineates the area between the throat and the breast or chest or whatever that thing is, which we will get to in due course. The black-throated canary always has something of a black throat or a deeper blotchiness round about that area, but not at all seasons and in all times is it that evident that it's a black-throated canary. And it is, I still find it's a bird that catches me out at times, because it's so beautifully vocal and is a superb mimic, especially in summer. And you think you found like some amazing bird and you look very, very hard to track it down, and it turns out to be a black-throated canary. And you say to the black-throated canary, you're not going to catch me out again, knowing full well that it certainly will. The cutthroat finch. Aye, my hearties, that's a cutthroat. I think a pirate would be proud of that. He's certainly slit the person from ear to ear. But despite the gory sounding name, it's actually quite a splendidly beautiful bird. And sort of an apt name, because the red stripe certainly runs across the line that you, if you had to cut along the dotted line, you would certainly have an ex-parrot or an ex-finch in this case. A black-faced waxbill tells you what a face is, because I've been wondering about what is a cheek, what is a face, and what is an ear in terms of a bird, and we'll keep track of that because I've now rearranged these slides so that those things don't always lie side by side, but that we can come back and consider them as we go along. The red-necked spurfowl is, of course, the bird on the right and not the one on the left, which you will all know is Swainson's spurfowl. And what is the real difference? Okay, the quickest difference is that the red-legged one is the red-necked one, and the black-legged one is not red-necked at Swainson's. So sometimes it's as clear as mud what has been used, and we sometimes just fall into having that as our explanation. Who would like to venture to me why this is a violet-eared waxbill? Yeah, because the ear is violet. I think that's a very good answer. And so why is it not a face, Linda? Okay, so its face isn't violet. So what Linda is saying is the patch between the eye and the bill, known as the lores, is actually not purple. So therefore, it is either the cheek or the ear that is purple or violet. In fact, in this, well, I'm told that's violet. To me, it's, yeah, in any case, it's close enough to violet to be called that. And I think if it was called a violet-faced waxbill, it would be a bit more problematic. Now, here's one that's quite problematic. That apparently is the cheek of the bird that is blue. Well, that kind of works to me on the left-hand picture, where it is apparent that there's an emanation of blue undercolor if someone hadn't painted a black line through it, which is blue. But if you look on the right-hand image, you just don't get a clear indication of where the blue actually starts and finishes, if there is blue, depending on what you call that kind of turquoisey color. So again, it's seasonal, and again, it's probably names are given very often to the male of the species and not the female, and certainly not applicable to juveniles and not applicable at all times of year. The bare-cheeked babbler is just thrown in on the left-hand side of that picture as another consideration of what we have called a cheek. So I think a cheek is behind the eye and quite difficult to distinguish from what an ear is. We can put up examples and debate it, but I think people get my point. Then there's this thing called a front. I've just never known what a front is. I've got to tell you that. So there's one example of what a front is. The white portion on that bird is its front, which is kind of the chin and the forehead. So in this case, the chin and the forehead must be the front, if that is indeed a white-fronted bee-eater. But then we consider the former yellow-eyed canary, which is now a yellow-fronted canary, which is not as yellow in the front if the previous thing applies as the yellow canary. So I have to express some kind of consternation with that word front, because almost everything that's got a front coming through it has got a different front, and those fronts seem to move and vary. The white-browed scrub robin, well, this one I quite like, but I do need to tell you the interesting thing that in Sabbat 2, somewhere to the east of Pilanesberg, there appeared to be quite a lot of white-browed robin chats suddenly appeared. And Sabbat 2's got a vetting process which disallows those things to happen. But once the errors creep in, by the way, I've got rid of the Johannesburg Cinderella waxbill, which I started, and I actually had Sandra Rose phone me and ask me to please put in my verification of the Cinderella waxbill, and I assured her it was a finger error, which I think I perpetrated twice or three times. So the Cinderella waxbill of Johannesburg has now been cleared up. but sometimes machine fault or errors in the SABAP system are self-perpetrating. And I think Jeff will remember the white-browed robin chat near Pilansberg, which persisted there for a good number of years until someone said, you just really don't get that bird there, and please can we now get rid of it. But the white-browed scrub robin, as you know, is a much more widespread and more westerly bird. And I have made the finger error between the two myself. So it is a bit of a problem, and you do have to be on your toes. However, I like that word brow. I don't really use the word supercilium. And perhaps it's technically correct to do so, but brow seems to be a very good explanation for that part of a bird's anatomy, and it carries it well on that particular species. Then the bird's eye view was originally the place where we zoomed in until I did the statistics, which have accompanied this slightly revised version of the talk. And I found out that references to the eye are few and far between. In fact, I think I'm showing possibly all the ones that there are. But the interesting thing about a red-eyed dove is it's brown-eyed, but then it has this patch of bare red skin, which is somewhat shaped like the human eye. And so the temptation or the explanation of it as a red-eyed dove is quite fine. But then you've got to consider the speckled pigeon also has apparently a red eye. So there's never going to be an absolute solution to that one. We've got used to the fact that bird is in fact a red-eyed dove, but in poor light, and particularly when you're some distance away, it's not always easy to distinguish between two very common birds, the red-eyed dove and the former Cape turtle dove, which is now called a ring-necked dove. The red-eyed bulbul, again, doesn't have a red eye, as far as I can see. But it does have a series of very fine wattles, or I don't know what you would call them, a fleshy area surrounding the eye, which is red in color, and makes it easy, certainly in the adult, to distinguish that bird from the dark-capped bulbul, which was formerly the black-eyed bulbul, which we're much more familiar with around here. And the spectacled weaver, which we know from the East Coast, has slipped in here, though I know there's a slide on it coming up a bit further down the line. The Cape white-eye similarly doesn't have a white eye, but similarly has that white pair of spectacles or monocles on each side, or whatever you would call it, which are a similar effect, but we're quite used to calling that bird a white eye, and no one thinks twice about it anymore. As far as the masked weaver is concerned, people know that the key distinguishing point between the southern masked weaver and the lesser masked weaver is probably the eye color. But secondly, also the shape of the mask, because the crown of the southern masked weaver is yellow, whereas the crown of the lesser masked weaver, in other words, the black comes much higher up the forehead in the case of the lesser masked weaver. But both of those are still deemed to be masks. The bearded scrub robin, now, a bearded scrub robin doesn't have a beard that looks anything like a bearded vulture, for example, whereas a bearded vulture has an emanation of longish feathers below the chin, which I suppose in human terms, you would equate that to a beard. But there are two stripes on this bird, and the one we would call a malar stripe, and the upper one we would call a moustachial stripe. And both of those are sort of a reference to human anatomy. So I'm not sure whether the beard of the bearded scrub robin is that malar stripe, or whether it is just the fact that it has a slightly fluffy chin. But interestingly, if you look at the scientific name, it's referred to as, by the term quadrivirgata, which means having 4 white stripes which emanate from the bill. And if you see a frontal view of this bird, you will make sense of that name. I didn't put in a frontal view, but I'll allow you to project, giving the profile from the one side. Then a wattle. So I mentioned in the case of those birds, there's a fleshy area which may or may not be a wattle, but certainly we know what a wattle is, and it's not always consistently the same thing. On a wattled starling, it is the fleshy bit which projects, particularly in the male, from the, where is it from? Below the bill, almost immediately. In the case of the wattled crane, it emanates from a fairly similar place. And then in the saddle-billed stork, you get is the wattle on the male or the female? Okay, they both have the wattle. One has a ring around its eye, which is the female. Okay. So, and the wattle is more pronounced in the male. And then the wattled lapwing, which I think everyone is all familiar with. Again, in the case of the wattled lapwing, it's virtually impossible to distinguish between male and female birds. Whereas in the case of the chin-spot batis, it's the only bird in Southern Africa which is named for the female. You see the male on the left there, and he clearly doesn't have a chin spot. That is his chin, that big white plain area, whereas the female on the right is the one that has the chin spot. So that's at least one up for the ladies, because most of the time birding is quite biased in favor of the males of the species. Where exactly a whiskered tern's whiskers are, I'm also not absolutely sure, but I imagine, looking at that, something of a close-up on the right there, that the general scruffiness or fluffiness of the chin is deemed to be the whiskers, but why it's not a beard, I'm not exactly sure. Now, birds don't have noses except for this one, and the nose is yellow. So from that, we can conclude that the nose is the ridge along the top of the bill or beak, or I don't know, or maybe not. These things are referred to often, or albatrosses in general, and their ilk, as tube noses. And I'm not sure if what's intended to be called the nose is the entire bit that's yellow in this bird. Again, most of the pictures I've shown are my own. In this case, I've taken them out of Wikipedia. Do not intend to have them passed on without attribution, but I can't tell you offhand the names of the authors. I just decided in these examples where I didn't have the picture myself, I would just take the liberty of what's technically, I suppose, an illegal move, but hopefully helpful to people. And similarly with the bridal tern, I'm totally indebted to the internet for being able to demonstrate that what appears on that bird's head in a certain respect represents the bridle of a horse, and therefore I think is well named, or creatively named at least. And then I did speak earlier about the spectacled weaver that has probably some of the coolest ray bands of any of the birds that exist. So we can finally move on to the main frame, as I call it, or the body. That is the main body, the big section. And the big section's most popular features in descending order are tail, wing, back, breast, belly, collar, band, chest, rump, mantle, bar, ring, flank, and vent, all of which become increasingly less common. I've highlighted breast and chest in a kind of bluish color because I'm not really sure what the difference is between a breast and a chest. And in humans, you would normally think that the breast was attributed to the female and the chest to the male. But in birds, I think it's as close to an interchangeable term as exists. And then I've also problematized or highlighted collar, band, bar, and ring, which all mean quite often close to the same thing, never exactly the same thing, and never the same in several different examples. But they don't, it's also hard to say whether those constitute an anatomical feature per se, or whether they constitute a marking. So, and in different cases, the answer to that is probably different. So let's start with the easy bits first and work our way downwards from there. We all know what a tail is, and it would appear that some birds have got very pronounced and distinctive tails, but obviously you're all aware that the bird on the left is a male and the one on the right is also a male at a different time of year. So that long pronounced tail is not a year-round feature. But there are obviously birds whose tail gives them their name, even though the feature is not present all year round. The long-tailed paradise wider is another example. And of course, the pin-tailed wider is a species which all but disappears in winter, unless you are quite an experienced birder and you can recognize them in their very much more inconspicuous winter form. But they're around. I don't think they go anywhere. I just think they get underreported on the whole. The fork-tailed drongo is named for its tail, and I'll just highlight here very briefly I think often very frustrating similarity to a southern black flycatcher, which is quite often in the same environment. And I find when you're atlasing, you can often overlook the one for the presence of the other. But obviously, when you see good photographs of them, like these are decent photographs, and it seems that you shouldn't be having difficulty telling between these birds. But when you see them at a distance and moving and not always in good light, you often need them to call, or you need to get closer to them to determine which of the two you're looking at. And there was a very good book about 30 years ago on lookalike birds. I enjoyed that book, I must say. It did make you at least aware of what you might be mistaking for what. And hopefully in the past 30 years, I do it less than I did in the beginning. But obviously, we're giving a talk like this just to make us aware of the mistakes that we can sometimes make. The red-winged starling, well, interestingly, when they sit perched, you just get that fine red-orange line along the base of the wing. When they fly, it becomes quite apparent. And the pale-winged starling, a similar thing. The pale patch is there. And I'm sure almost everyone here is already aware that the female of the red-winged starling is easily distinguished by its grayish head. The black-winged stilt, here's just a good example. Obviously, the name is perfectly appropriate for the adult. That thing that is black is the thing that I would call the wing, except the problem is that in the background, you see a juvenile, and that thing called the wing is not yet black. Not objecting to the name, just warning you of that possible challenge. The greyback Cameroptera is the one which we would expect around here, and a former bleating warbler, it was called. And I like that name because they have got one very little distinctive call, which usually alerts you to their presence, which sounds very much like a little sheep somewhere up in the trees. The challenge is determining or being able to hear the difference between the call of the greyback Cameroptera and the greenback Cameroptera, and where the biggest challenge exists is in, I would say, the Kruger Park, where there's kind of an indistinguishing indistinguished blur between where you might find the one or the other, and there are places where you find both or neither. The violet-backed starling, I love the old name plum-colored starling, so I'm a little bit nostalgic for it. But again, it's discriminatory because it applies well enough to the male, but not to the female. And I would call that, I kind of like plum-colored because, you know, what is the difference between violet and purple, for example? And then, you know, plum-colored just gives it that, because to me, violet and purple are both a clean admixture between blue and red. Whereas what I see here is almost a movement towards what we'd call maroon. And that's why plum-colored was such a nice name. It's not that middle purple or violet that's halfway between red and blue. But while most of the starlings shift towards the blue side, and we know that they also shift in light between blue and green, this one has got this very distinctive, beautiful plum color. Thanks. But obviously the female is brownish and relatively plain, but I still think a very beautiful bird. The orange-breasted bush shrike, I suppose I could have updated this because I certainly have better pics of it than this. But again, it's just and I've gone into the discussion about whether at all there's a difference between a breast and a chest. The lilac-breasted roller is another one where the breast is the chosen word, and another example would be the red-breasted swallow. And then again, I raised that question about colors, whether you would call that color red, indeed, but obviously it's a liberally chosen word. What would be I think russet might be a little bit closer. Now, Jeff, what word would you use? And Linda, you guys are artists.
Burnt sienna.
Burnt sienna. All right. Okay.
That's not gonna fly.
One sienna does not a summer make. I think I saw a burnt umber 63. Then there's the yellow-bellied greenbill, which we can't say where the belly starts or ends because the yellow extends a long way beyond what we know as the belly. So both of these quite different pictures taken in different light. But the one comment that I'd make on this bird, and I think a lot of people have noticed it, is that it's creeping down towards the southwest. So it used to be a bird that you'd never expect to see anywhere out of Limpopo, but now I had one at Hammanskraal in the Dinner King Game Reserve. I've had it at even nearer Pretoria than that, and in Pilanesberg it's become quite common. So for whatever reason, that bird is expanding its range towards the west and the south, I think. Jeff, have you got any explanation of that?
We first saw him just north of Nels Flag probably 30 years ago. And then, you know, as you say, just progressively coming closer and closer to the
Yeah.
There's no obvious, I don't think anyone's looked at why.
Yeah. And then another example of a belly is the rufous-bellied heron. This bird kindly came all the way to Irene so that I could photograph it. But historically, I expected it to be a bird that you had to drive to the Okavango Delta for. Or that's where I certainly first became aware of the species. In fact, I think this was, for me, a photographic lifer. Well, because I went digital in 2009 and I haven't been up to Botswana since then. So, but it's always also nice to start your list again, because then you add new species to it. So photographically, I'm now in the I'm somewhere in the 560s, which is quite nice. In atlasing, I'm somewhere in the 620s. And in real listing, or if that's the thing, I'm somewhere in the 660s. I'm waiting to get to 666, at which point I will log the common minor. Yeah, I'm keeping it. I've kept it back. It's not on my list yet, but so it's coming up shortly. I will announce it as a lifer when once I clock up 665. And this is the black-collared barbet, which certainly, as you can see from the juvenile on the right, there has got a black collar. If again that thing's a collar and not a band, and all those other terms that we were banding about. But the face itself, you can see, becomes increasingly red. And I don't know if there is somewhere in the world a red-faced barbet or why that somewhat arbitrary declaration was made. But the collar in this bird is actually a white spot on the neck. So I don't know, it looks like about a quarter collar to me if I were to measure it, but I don't think that would fly or even perch.
I think the collar there is actually the blue, which would be half breastbanded or something more accurate. The origin of the name is that torquata, the semi-torquata, the actual half breastband, which is certainly a bit lower and a bit off to the side of the color.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Jeff. It probably clears something up for me a bit about that one, because I've always thought that was quite a shaky name. But as people know, I'm known to not approve of every new bird name that appears. And I once wrote quite a scathing article in 2005 when they came up with the spate of bird name changes, many of which some of us didn't approve of too much. And so I made some fairly clear statements about how absurd a black-back puffback, for example, is to me. But, you know, maybe someone's going to explain that bird to me one day. I've been waiting about 16 years for that explanation. It hasn't been forthcoming. Banded martin is, I think, banded. So that is what a band is, if it's not Led Zeppelin, I guess. But again, that's also what a band is there. And forgive me if I'm struggling with my counting, but anyway, the middle one is also deemed to be a band. So that is a black and a white and a black band, according to the person that deemed that to be a band. And then again, why aren't they frontal half collars? Because they don't seem to go all the way around, etc. So, I mean, the real point is there's no real consistency. That thing's double banded now, but it seems to have 3 bands based on the previous logic. But you know that there's also a 3-banded one, which is pretty much more 3-banded than this one. So those names are always contentious, but I think, you know, having looked at all that, we now know what a band is, or we think we know what a band is, or one day we'll know what a band is. Anyway, so this one has got a chest or a breast in versions that I've seen, which is, as I say, kind of fine, because I don't think there's a huge difference, but we just remind ourselves between the difference between the black-chested snake eagle and the martial eagle. Well, the frontal spotting is a very, very good clue, but also there's an obvious size difference when once you are used to that. By the way, you know, I mention it quite often, but in the Dinnerking Game Reserve, where I took this photograph, we have Gauteng's only known breeding pair of martial eagles. Then that is a black-chested prunier and not black-throated for whatever reasons. But yeah, banded or collared or, you know, there's so many of those terms, and all of them seem to mean different things with different species. The yellow-rumped tinkerbird has indeed got a yellow rump, but in my sole decent photograph of it, that yellow rump is hidden by the wings. So I just threw in one to show you quite clearly what it is that I think a rump is, or approximately. And you all probably know that trick with the 3 common white-rumped species, and that is that the white-rumped swift has got a deep fork in its tail, and that makes a W for white-rumped. The Horus swift has got an almost square tail, and that makes the H for Horus. And the little swift has got a square tail, so that makes the L for little swift, the square tail. And then the Horus, you've bent your crossbar of your H a little bit because, I don't know, someone banged their head on it or something. But I've always found that a good mnemonic for picking it out. And in terms of the difference between the white-rumped swift and the Horus swift, the band of the white-rumped swift on the rump is much finer than the one on the Horus swift. The bar-throated Apollos, again, the comment about the throat, where in fact was the throat. I may have duplicated the slide. Sorry, I reworked this today, and I think I've shown you that bird already. But the ring plover, I'm not a big fan of this thing called bird ringing, but I did appreciate the irony of seeing someone ringing a ring plover. And then the tawny flank prinia is the only one who bears up that name. But I think tawny is the right color, and I think flank is the right portion of the anatomy. And the chestnut vented tit babbler, I think everyone's aware that the top part of that region of the anatomy is called the rump, and the bottom part is called the vent. So I think also, besides being a rather long and unwieldy name, it's not an inaccurate one. Sorry, it's not actually a tit babbler anymore. It's now a warbler. Yeah. So now we finally get to the bottom of things, and the bottom of things is legs and feet. We've got toes, legs, feet, heel, claw, boot. We really have a boot. We'll get to that. Right, the short-toed rock thrush. I don't know what its toe was deemed short in comparison to, but I suppose anything can be short if you want it to be. But it's the one that you get to the northwest. So here in Gauteng, you can actually get all 3 rock thrushes. The Cape rock thrush, which is quite widespread. The short-toed rock thrush, which occurs in the Magaliesberg, for example. And then what's the third one called?
Sentinel.
The sentinel rock thrush, which you get where? Suikerbosrand, yeah. Yeah, and Devon. Then we've got these references to legs, which are awfully rare. So I had to download someone's black leg kittiwake, a bird which I've never seen myself. I may as well add that I haven't seen a long leg buzzard either. Has anyone in this room seen a long leg buzzard? Yeah. Yeah. Who's seen the kittiwake? Okay. Yeah, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not a problem. So anyone who's been to Alaska, Greenland, those places, won't think that that's such a cool bird, but it doesn't venture into the Southern Hemisphere too regularly. So it's a great one to get on your Southern African list. Then a spike-heeled lark. Well, I'm not sure where the heel is, but because, so here's the thing, a bird's got a tibiotarsus, and so its leg bends this way. So in actual fact, in human equivalent terms, that's the foot, and that's the toe, or those are the toes there. So it's walking on tippy toes, but the bend goes that way because that's the ankle, whereas we have a knee at that point. But the knee of the bird is usually located much closer towards the hips, as you know from eating chicken, for example. And then a short-clawed lark, I don't know either how it was short or what it was compared to, but if I'm allowed to give a lecture on something that I know absolutely nothing about, then I will choose to make my feature this one here, the booted eagle. The boots of that are somewhat like the clothes of the emperor. I cannot tell you with any degree of certainty where its boots are or whether it left its boots at home, but everyone's always told you that it has boots, and you will believe that it has boots, just like you will believe that the emperor has a very, very smart suit, which I suppose, I mean, obviously I'm joking, but I do think you believe what you get told. So anything or everything that I've told you tonight might be completely untrue. And some of it I'm also grappling with myself. But I'm very, very pleased to have filled you with some of this information, some true, some false, and probably quite a lot debatable. But we do have these conventions of what we call things. And I do think by going through things as we have done tonight, we've familiarized ourselves with things that you probably knew already, but it's quite good to always have an example and a referent for that thing. And of course, who was it that said, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, a man with one watch knows the time, a man with two watches is never quite sure. So similarly, when once you've seen 2 or 3 hoods and bands and all those good things, you realize that you're actually not quite sure what that thing is, although at the same time, you're more sure what it is than you were before, if you know what I mean. So finally, we get down to where we've been trying to get down to all this time, and that is to look at the legs and feet of the bird, which are briefly described here. Feet aren't the sole determinant because there are non-passerines which have the same foot pattern as passerines, but there are no passerines that do not have that structure of 1 rear-facing toe and 3 forward-facing toes. Other definitions which define what is a passerine is to call it a perching bird or a singing bird, but neither of those definitions is absolutely perfect. But certainly we know from our birding experience that feet are important. And so you can see that in this picture, you're looking at, what's the one on the left? Okay, a little egret, which is slightly bigger than the one on the right, which is a cattle egret. So how did the Western cattle egret not be the little egret? I don't know. Maybe because they were comparing the little egret to something bigger than it to make it little, which is sensible, of course, because then it becomes little. The ostrich is, you know, classically on the front page of Roberts, as for all of us that were brought up with that, what was it, edition 4, something like that. But obviously, because it's the most unsparrow-like bird that exists, it doesn't even have the 4 toes, it doesn't even have the 3 toes, but it has 2, and one of them is fairly rudimentary. So they're amazing birds in terms of their bipedalism and their balance and the extreme power that you get in those legs. And I've been in fear of an ostrich in the bush, and I think most of us have had that experience where we just thought, actually don't really want to be taking this thing on. But a tip is, of course, if you can get hold of an acacia branch and hold that out in front of you, it'll stop the ostrich from getting close enough to you to kick you in those instances where the ostrich is showing persistent aggressive behavior. Another bird with pretty odd feet in relative terms is the rock penguin, African rock penguin, which has got these interesting flippers, which are either adapted wings as flippers or adapted flippers as wings. I don't know, but you know those birds from boulders and wherever it is where you see them on your Western Cape holidays. Other examples of birds with webbed feet are ducks and gulls, for example, as everyone's aware. Then there are these lobe toes, which you find in moorhens, coots, and the like. Then there's a reduced fourth toe, which you find particularly amongst francolins and spurfowl. But in the case of the spurfowl, there's also the spur. So if you look on the left there, what species is that? Looks Natalish to me. Yeah. But it's certainly you can see there are two projections from the back of the leg, the one being the rudimentary toe and the other one being the spur from which it derives its name. Then there's birds where the rear-facing toe is completely absent, such as particularly coursers and dickhooks or thickneys. Then birds like hornbills and kingfishers have syndactyl toes where the third and fourth toe are fused at the base. The outer toe of parrots and owls, as a lot of you are already aware, is reversible. So it can sit with 3 toes in the one direction and 1 in the other, or 2 and 2, depending on what mood it's in today. The zygodactyl toe is the instance found in woodpeckers, wrynecks, barbets, and honeyguides, where the first and fourth toes face backwards and the second and third toe face forwards, which is an interesting contrast to the arrangement which you get in, for example, mouse birds, where mouse birds have all 4 toes facing in the same direction. That's why they clamber in the awkward and clumsy way in which they appear to clamber. And that's why you never see a swift perching, because swifts are their close relatives and can only cling rather than perch. And then there's the fabulous thing that some of these guys chose to rearrange a different set of toes. And that is this arrangement, the heterodactyl toes, where toe 1 and 2 face backwards, toe 3 and 4 face forwards. And these are the trogons. On the left, you see the fabulous South African Narina trogon. And on the right, you see 4 birds, which you can see in one tree in Costa Rica. Just saying. So that brings me to the end of tonight's lecture. I hope I've been snappy enough. Just to go through the conclusion that we have here, we've looked at 320 species that derive their names through their species name from a feature of the anatomy. There's another 34 which derive their genus names from the same. The percentage of bird names worldwide that derive from this form of description, I estimate would be about the same. I speak under correction and may be wrong, but I did research 1/10 of the world's birds, and I think that would be statistically significant. But obviously, I'm speaking about English-speaking common names, and I think English speakers have probably got similar trends throughout the world. I would say that the species that's named after the person who described that, or the person attributed by the person who described it, are in decline throughout the world, and probably changing in favor of the others, which we'll look at. The most frequent anatomical features described in the birds is the bill, the tail, the wing, the back, and the head, in that descending order. The most common form of specific name isolates a feature on the bird which is unique and describes this feature, often with reference to color and pattern, even though the designated characteristics are not necessarily unique or diagnostic, as I demonstrated with the instance of the spurfowls. Learning species name is good for reinforcing and developing your vocabulary. And I hope that some people have realized that they know less after this lecture than they knew before the lecture. But legs and feet are the least common reference, which is paradoxical because legs and feet are actually the single most important feature that's referred to in the general classification of birds and allows us to contemplate bizarre things like the closeness in relationship between a mouse bird and a swift, which is not obviously apparent, and the distance and actual parallel evolution between a swift and a swallow, for example. Then just to go over what other derivations there are, the person who derived it, as I said, such as Levaillant cisticola, a geographical region such as a Cape sparrow, a habitat descriptor such as a marsh owl, or an onomatopoeic descriptor such as a hardy-daw ibis or Diederik cuckoo. I may stand under correction about the Diederik cuckoo, but I've never heard a better explanation, and I certainly know that that bird says that its name is Diederik. So I'm imagining that that name has an onomatopoeic derivation, and I've never seen anything different to that. Each of those topics described in the previous bullet have not been included in this discussion, but are large enough to warrant a lecture on their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really I'm sure you all agree, a wonderful lecture and a